Previously, we discussed how to select objects by clicking them, and also how to move the camera body around by using the transform tools, the move tool, rotate tool, and the scale tool. Now, there's more complex ways to make selections, and also ways to apply these transform tools to regular objects. For example, in this scene, I have 3 soccer balls and a plane. Now, you can make your own soccer balls by going up to Create, Polygon Primitives, Soccer Ball. In any case, if I wanted to select these, I can just click on them. However, if I select more than one, you'll see that only one remains selected. Now, if I want to pick more than one, what I can do is use the Shift key. For example, I can click on the first one, then press Shift, click the second one, press Shift again, and click the third one. And there I have 3 soccer balls selected. Now, only the last one turns green. The other 2 remain white. What happens is the last one selected is the one that's shown in the channel box. In other words, the last one's transforms are visible here. The other 2 that remain white are not visible in the channel box. However, the fact that more than one is selected is indicated by the ... beside the name. In any case, the last one selected appears here and remains green. Now that I have more than one selected, I can actually move them as a unit. I can use my transform tools to move these all together at once. For example, if I click on the Move tool, I'll get the axis handle. Now the handle appears at the pivot point of the last one selected, and the pivot point is a central point that each object receives. We'll talk more about that in a future video, but for now, just keep in mind that the transform will appear in the center of these soccer balls. So the last one selected gets the handle. And once the handle appears, I can drag it to move the soccer balls as a unit. You can either grab it by the center to freeform move, or grab an axis handle. Now you notice as I move these, I can let them penetrate each other. For instance, the soccer balls can go through the plane. Now if you're just positioning objects, it doesn't really matter. Eventually when you get to rendering animation, you do want to avoid the objects penetrating each other, but in this case it doesn't really matter. So there you can move all 3 of these objects as a single unit just by selecting them in the correct order. Now you can also apply the other transform tools to do something similar. For instance, if I go to the rotate tool and click that, once again the handle is centered on that last one selected. But I can rotate them all at one time. Now you notice as I rotate, however, they don't rotate as if welded together. They rotate around their own personal pivots. In other words, each one rotates around its own central point. So in this case, they rotate like a series of tires on a car. They rotate at the same speed and in the same direction, but not as if they're glued together or welded together. Now, as you use these transform tools, you might notice that the transform handle is too big or too small. In fact, your transform handle for rotate might be in the center of the ball. What you can do is scale that to make it easier to see and manipulate. If you press the plus key on your keyboard, it makes the handle bigger. If you press the minus key, it does the opposite and shrinks it down. So by pressing the minus or plus key on your keyboard, you can tailor the size of the handle to make it easier to manipulate. So now that I have all 3 of these objects selected, I can also use a scale. I'll click the Scale tool, and the same thing, the handle appears on the last one selected, and I can scale it by the middle box to scale all 3. Again, they scale around their own personal pivots, or I can scale one of the axis handles. When I'm using scale, this makes for unusual shapes. Now you may have noticed that whenever I use a Move tool, Rotate tool, or Scale tool, the axis handles for those transform tools are lined up with the world axis. In other words, the Z corresponds to the Z, the Y with the Y, and the X with the X. They're running the same directions. That's because the handles initially, or by default, are based on the world axis, so their axis handles lined up with the world axis. You can change it by going into the options for the individual tools. For instance, if I go to Rotate and double-click the Rotate tool, double-click Fast, the tool settings come up for the Rotate. You'll see that under Rotate Mode, it's set to World. However, I can change that to Local. Just click the Local radio button, and then the handle is aligned with the pivot point of the object. So when I look at the handle now in the viewport, they don't line up with the world axis. In other words, the green axis handle does not point in the same direction. You can see by the world indicator, Y goes up and down. However, on this rotate, it's going side to side. Now you can still rotate as normal by grabbing the handle, however the axis orientation is just different. We'll explore this further when we get back to pivots later on. But just for now, remember that you can either manipulate an object in a world space or in a local space. But for now, I'm going to return this to world. Now that's true with the other transform tools too. For instance, I can go to the Move tool, double-click that to get up its tool settings, and you'll see that the Move tool's move axis is set to world. In this case, I can set that to object instead, and it'll have its own oriented move axis. So you can see in this case that the X, Y, and Z do not correspond to the world indicator. Again, you can still move these things around, but the axis handles are located based on how that object was originally created and how it's since been rotated and positioned. But once again, I'll return this to world for now. Now, if you want to close the tool settings for any one of these transform tools, just go up to the top right and click the Close button. In any case, you can see how you can move more than one object if they're selected with the Shift key, and also how you can move things in a more complex manner.